Okay, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this, the last online talk of 2022. In May of this year, thanks to the considerable efforts of this evening's speaker, Dr. Stefano Baccolo, we unveiled a plaque at the Palazzo San Clemente in Florence, which was the only home that Prince Charles Edward Stuart himself personally owned, where he lived for 10 years during the later period of his life. And that was, we the association actually approved the funding for this plaque 30 years ago in a council meeting in 1992, but it took Stefano's considerable diplomatic and organizational skills to bring it to fruition with the help of our friends in the mayor's office in Florence and the current owners of the palace, the University of Florence. Stefano undertook research on the Stuart court in exile in Italy for his doctoral thesis and gave us a talk on the last courtiers of the Stuarts in the Palazzo San Clemente when we unveiled the plaque there back in May. He also has published some of his research in our journal, The Jacobite, including an article, Charles Stuart in Italy, in the spring 2015 edition, and From John Stuart to Carlos Stuart, A Legacy of Loyalty, in the summer 2019 edition. So tonight he's going to tell us a story of the courtiers of the man who styled himself as Charles III for 22 years, not our new king, but the figure more popularly known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, who assumed the mantle of the King over the Water following the death of his father James in 1766, and the story of the small and disparate band of loyalists who stuck with him through thick and thin and continued to serve him at the Palazzo San Clemente until the very end of his life and his other residences, is little known, but deserves greater exposure because it is a very interesting story. So it's my great pleasure and indeed my privilege to speak to us this evening on the last Stuart courtiers, the leading authority on the Stuarts in Italy, Dr. Stefano Baccolo. So Stefano, the floor is now yours.
Stefano, you have to unmute yourself.
You'll need to unmute Stefano.
He is
At
unmuted.
the moment, your microphone is still muted.
Oh, it is, yeah. I'm asking him to unmute. I can't actually unmute him. I'm just asking him to unmute. Got it.
Okay. Okay. Do you hear and see me? Yeah?
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike, for your kind words. And I cannot but start this meeting but paying a tribute to Professor Edward Corp, who has been for me a constant source of inspiration since my first encounter with his works. As many of you for sure know well, Professor Corp has centered his studies on the exiled court of the Stuart, following its evolutions since 1689 till the death of James III in 1766. With such studies, he debunked the myth that the Stuart court in exile was dreary and little, giving it back the prestige of a true royal court. Housed in sumptuous palaces, strong of often more than 100 people and powerful enough to leave a lasting impression on the art and culture of the time. Professor Corp's studies stopped in 1766 because, in his words, after such date, the court was no more royal and no more of exiles. As I had the pleasure to discuss with him, however, such assertion was quite a provocation by Professor Caryll, and I have dedicated much of my own studies to answer and challenge such words. So today, I want to start with you and to share with you some of my results, giving you the portraits of the men who peopled the Stuart court after 1766, a court that was no more accepted as royal from its surroundings, who was on a completely different scale from what was the court held by James III at his best, but which nonetheless traced a continuity with it and maintained an exceptional status in its context and relations. Charles III, as he would have liked to be called, had never, from the Catholic powers, the de jure recognition of his rights that James III enjoyed for his whole life. This situation obliged Charles to live in isolation for some time and, at the end, to resort to live under an alias. In public, when in Rome, he was Baron Douglas, and in Florence, the Count of Albany. But inside the walls of his palazzo and in the houses of many of his prestigious friends among the Italian aristocracy, he was the king. His court was something particular. Who composed it? He had gentlemen in waiting, servants always wearing the royal liveries, and even a Moor servant to keep in line with the fashion of the time. A complete account of his entourage is impossible in our few time, but to give you an idea, keep in mind the court was composed approximately by 60 people. The greatest part were Italian servants, but it's notable that many of them were from families who had served the Stuarts for generations. There was also always some Frenchmen, we know 7 of them, and most importantly, there was the British component, which never counted more than 10 people at the same time, but kept a leading role. Among these, we count 7 Scotsmen, 6 Englishmen, 4 Irishmen, and also 1 Welshman. We must also keep note of 1 French and 2 Italian women who were married with Jacobite exiles. We will focus today on some of the most representative members of the British part of the court, starting with 2 men who succeeded in the role of Majordomo. This was one of the main roles at the court, being the man leading all the domestic affairs and managing the economy of the house. In the often complex economic situation of Charles, this meant the Majordomo had power on nearly all the money of his king. To give an example, at the time of the Duchess of Albany, when she joined his father's court, she had an allowance who was controlled and paid to her by the Majordomo, who had also power to make loans and debts in the name of his master. In the Majordomos of Charles, we find many common traits, which suggest also the inclinations of their master. So it's interesting to see that they both were Scotsmen, and the first was chosen to replace James III's Majordomo, who had been an Englishman. Both were of Protestant religion. trying to show Charles' friendship with the reformed faith. Both were from the middle class, preferred by Charles probably because they were pragmatic men with experience of the world. Both escaped Scotland after the 45 and kept faithfully serving Charles for the 20 years following Culloden, notwithstanding his dramatic situation. To both, Charles granted a baronetcy in recognition of their service and to ennoble his own entourage. And we must say James had done the same for his last majordomo. The first to hold the role from 1766 is John Hay of Restalrig, a man 10 years older than Charles. He was born in 1709. You see him here in a rare miniature that is from his 60s. He was the younger son of a famous Scottish lawyer. He had been a tax collector in his youth, and during the 45 had held an administrative role in the Jacobite army, ending up being the quartermaster at Culloden. Because of this, his name was explicitly mentioned in the Act of Attainder of 1746. So he was, to all effects, an exile with a death sentence waiting to him in Scotland. Hay was dismissed after only 2 years, together with the secretary and gentleman in waiting of Charles, because of a quarrel which, however, we must say was manipulated by Cardinal Henry of York, Charles's brother, who wanted to get rid of the Protestant part of the court, which he despised. Hay's successor was one John Steuart, coming from a minor branch of the Ardvorlich clan, affiliated to the Duke of Atholl. From what we know, John joined Charles during his escape after Culloden. Since his return in France, John served the prince as his valet de chambre, an humble role which made him something between the servant, the bodyguard, the confidant. At some point, Charles used him as a sort of secret agent. John was his trusted factotum for 20 years. When Cardinal York tried to get rid of him, together with the other Protestants, he failed badly, and Charles reasserted his authority, making him the new majordomo and his favorite. With the encouragement of his master, John married also an Italian woman employed at the court, whose name was Rosa Fiorani. The impressive devotion of John is shown in the names he gave to his 3 children: Charlotte, the eldest, Charles, the first male, and Edward, the second. John remained at his place till the death of his master, achieving an extraordinary record of 40 years of service. Charles was deeply grateful and provided largely to him and his family in the testament. John received an annuity of 2,450 scudi romani, which was more than 10 times the salary of a middle-class man of the time. Nothing, however, could outweigh the loss of his master, and the last accounts we have about him after Charles' death tell us the story of a broken man, prematurely aged. The only thing we have of this man is not even the portrait, but just the signature. And so we have put it here, and you can read it. The second pair we meet is that of Charles's secretaries. The first was Andrew Lumisden, a bourgeois from Edinburgh, who had been personal secretary to Charles during the 45 and proscribed, had fled to Rome, where he had entered the service of James III as under-secretary. At King James's death, Lumisden was already become first secretary and was the only man in the court to maintain his role with the succession of Charles. He was under heavy distress in doing his job and was quite happy to take the occasion of the quarrel already mentioned to leave the court. Nonetheless, he remained absolutely loyal to his master for his whole life, as transpires from his correspondence. He was a man of culture, and after retiring, wrote a book of success about the antiquities of Rome. So a portrait of him survived, and here we see him in an engraving by his brother-in-law, who was the famous Robert Strange. He was replaced by John Baptist Caryll, 3rd Baron Caryll of Durford, a Jacobite peer, whose title had been created by James II in 1699 for John's great uncle, who had been Secretary of State of the exiled king at Saint-Germain. His family was English, but her mother was Scottish, being a Mackenzie and the daughter of the Earl of Seaford. He was the last in a line of Jacobite peers. And so I've put here his genealogical tree and the portrait of his great uncle John, the First Lord. Sadly, we don't have any portrait of John Baptist himself, but once again, you can see his signature on the right. Caryll was born in 1713, a rich owner of Sussex, from a Catholic family of long Jacobite tradition. Progressively involved in Jacobite intrigues, he was among the organizers of the abortive French expedition of 1744-45 and ended up dissolving his entire fortune to support the Jacobite cause. Repaired in France, he acted as intermediary between the Jacobite court in Rome and the French government, being the organizer of the wedding of Charles with Louis of Stolberg-Gedern. Caryll joined the court in Rome while preparing the wedding in 1771 and remained there till 1775, serving as Secretary of State, so not a simple secretary. And in fact, he served just for the honor of such role, never being paid by the Stuarts. Caryll came in Italy with his wife also. Her name was Mary Carisbrooke from Lancashire, and she served as main lady-in-waiting of the Jacobite queen, Louise Stolberg. It was this couple of English Catholics who kept standing the wedding of Charles and Louise, which in fact started to fall apart as soon as Caryll resigned to return in France because of personal affairs. He continued, however, to serve the Stuarts even from afar till his own death in 1788, the same year of Charles. In particular, is to be mentioned a fact known to few, that in 1787, during his efforts to obtain money for the Stuarts, he had also an encounter with William Pitt the Younger. So an interview between the Jacobite Secretary of State and the Hanoverian Prime Minister, I would say, when history surpasses imagination. Caryll was rewarded for his services, receiving by Charles the Order of the Thistle. He was much proud of that, since his grandfather, Lord Seaford, had been one of the original knights of the order. The last role we look at today is that of the gentleman in waiting. Charles for a long time kept 3 gentlemen in waiting at the same time because he felt it necessary for his dignity, especially when he went out publicly, always with 3 carriages, to underline his status. Charles had several men covering these roles at different times, both British and Italians. We will talk of 2 which we can consider the most representative of them, Harry Stafford and Henry Nairn. This last one you see portrayed here in old age. Harry Stafford, even if his genealogical tree is not completely certain, seems to be the last of an entire dynasty of courtiers who married the Jacobite cause. He was in fact a grandson or great-grandson of William Howard, 1st Viscount Stafford, here in the picture, who is remembered as a Catholic martyr, beatified in 1929, being unjustly condemned to death for the so-called Papish plot of 1680. Notwithstanding the tragic death of their forefather, the Staffords kept loyal to the Stuarts and were rehabilitated by James II, who elevated Harry's uncle to the title of Earl in 1688. The Staffords then chose to follow their king in exile, and we have one Stafford as gentleman of the bedchamber of James II at Saint-Germain. His brother was the secretary of the Queen. In the 3rd generation of the family, we saw one lady in waiting of the Queen, a governor to the Duke of York, and 2 gentlemen in waiting of the Prince of Wales. One of these was the Henry Stafford, of whom we talk today. Henry Stafford shared with Charles Stewart his turbulent years in Paris, including the imprisonment because of the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle. In the following years, which Charles spent living often under aliases around France, Henry was left in charge of his household in Avignon. There, he waited the return of his master for 20 years, being progressively obliged to fire all the servants and selling everything to pay the debts of Charles, and coming to the point of suffer cold and hungry. From his letters to Charles, we can see a man that was ready to suffer any humiliation and hardship for the sake of his master. We see here an extract from a letter of 1757. I shall either pledge or sell everything I have, even to the last shirt for your service, he wrote. When Charles came back to Rome in 1766, he called Stafford to join him, and he came with an Irish liveried servant. That was all was left of the prince's household of Avignon. Henry was then old and sick, and died in service only 2 years later. The Honourable Henry Nairn, better known with the courtesy title Milord Nairn, was the 10th and last son of Lord John Nairn, Brigadier General of the Highland Army in the 45. Henry left Scotland just 17 years old to join the regiment of the Courtiers Royal, which was being raised in France. He took part to the Flanders campaign of 1745 and was promoted lieutenant. With the Castle Hill Company, crossed the sea and joined the Jacobite army in Scotland. There, he distinguished himself for valor in the sieges of Fort Augustus and Fort William, where he was also wounded. Nonetheless, he went on fighting till Culloden. In this tragic defeat, Henry was able to escape capture together with his father. After months in hiding among the highlands, the Nairns were able to fly to the continent, and Henry joined back his regiment. With the Courtiers Royal, of whom you see here the uniform, Henry took part to the siege of Maastricht and to the 7 Years' War, ending up being promoted captain. Then he retired at Sancerre in the Loire, with a father, 1 brother, and 1 sister. There, the Nairns gave life to a strong colony of Jacobite exiles of Protestant religion. They were the heart of the Jacobite colony in Sancerre. Among them lived also the famous Neil MacEachern, whose son were to become Napoleon's Field Marshal MacDonald. By 1782, however, Henry was the only survivor of his family. He was probably thinking his life was over, an exiled middle-aged man without any relative left. But just 2 years later, in 1784, his king called for him from Florence, asking to come to his court as écuyer to his recently legitimated daughter, the Duchess of Albany. Henry answered readily, and notwithstanding being in economic difficulties, escorted the new Duchess to Florence and remained there at the court, refusing any salary because he reputed that serving his king was a sufficient reward. Also him was awarded by Charles with the Order of the Thistle, which had already been displayed by his father, Lord Nairn. So we can imagine how important this recognition was for him. From the sources we have, it's easy to infer that Henry Nairn remained at court not much because of his duty to the Duchess, but because of his devotion to Charles, of whom he became the constant companion and main assistant during his decline, during his last years of sickness. In fact, it was in the arms of this loyal man that Charles passed away in January 1788. After Charles's death, Henry came back to France, where he remained till 1804, surviving the hardship of the French Revolution, only worried of the damages it posed to Cardinal York, now the last of the Stuarts. At the dawn of the Napoleonic Empire, he came back to Scotland, where he lived close to his only nephew. The wife of this one was Caroline Oliphant, known to the great public as Lady Nairn, the great songwriter. Henry passed away after his last king, after Cardinal York, in 1812, at 90 years of age, and we can suppose that a bit of his spirit and adventurous tales lives on in the unforgettable songs of Lady Nairn. Those we have met today are only some of the last Stuart courtiers. I hope anyway that their stories were enough to underline the main strength of the Jacobite movement and the fil rouge that joined the experiences of the courts in exile of 3 generations of Stuarts, the principle of loyalty. Even if the fortunes of the Stuarts were declining, or even gone forever, till their dynasty was supported and surrounded by men who, against any convenience, continued to assert and pledge their loyalty to the kings and the cause for whom they had fought and suffered. So I hope I've been clear enough and brief enough. And if you have any question, or would you like to